for inviting me. Thanks to the organisers of what has been an extremely interesting day for me, if a little bit on the warm side. I feel on this panel as though perhaps I'm being set up somewhat to be the pantomime villain of the piece, but I will. I'll do my best to set out my position on the questions that Paul asked. But before I get to those, let me just say a word about my own background. Some of you will know me very well. I spent a career mainly in the Ministry of Defence, with some time spent in the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office. And I came into and out of the nuclear issues at various periods in that career, probably starting with the time that I worked for the late Sir Michael Quinlan, who, as you will probably all know, was one of the sort of deepest thinkers of the British establishment on these nuclear matters. So I guess, my view, given my background, will not come as any great surprise. I believe that the UK should maintain its nuclear deterrent capability, and I believe that a submarine-based ballistic missile system is the best option. But let me say another few words about UK policy, because this has come up from time to time in the course of today's discussions. And I think that there's been some caricaturing of the policy. The policy is to narrowly define the circumstances in which the deterrent would ever be fired. Vital national interests is the phrase that has been used consistently by governments of all stripes since the start of the nuclear age, and that remains the case today. It is sometimes a difficult position to defend, because if people ask you to describe precisely the circumstances in which a decision would be taken, you are driven to concede that the circumstances are remote and difficult to envisage in the current security climate and the current international climate. But it is impossible to rule out circumstances in which Britain's vital national interests or those of its allies would be threatened in such a way that not to have a deterrent capability would be to place the country at a severe peril. But as others have commented, that is not to say that the policy is to maintain a nuclear capability ad infinitum. The policy goes hand in hand with the seeking the objective of a nuclear-free world. But as others have said today, that is done. The UK has played probably a bigger part in reducing its nuclear arsenal than any of the other nuclear powers. But it is extremely difficult to see how that objective can be achieved in the current environment or for the foreseeable future. Just as an aside, I don't agree with Dominic when he says that sub-strategic Trident is a usable nuclear weapon. All nuclear weapons should be regarded as political weapons, which are to be used only in the extreme circumstances which I outlined. But for a nuclear deterrent to be credible, you do need to have some ability to, some room for choice in the yield of the weapon deployed. I don't regard myself as an absolutist, which is a phrase I saw that Nick Ritchie used in a recent article that he'd written about the Trident renewal debate. And actually, I think that I don't, when I think about the people I've worked with over the years on these issues, of course, there will be some that you might say are absolutist, but I think that most people most people in government approach these things in a rational way. You may not believe it, but there are debates within government. And indeed, during the last coalition government, the Trident Alternatives Review, which was overseen by Danny Alexander, was a pretty thorough investigation of all the options and the considerations associated with this subject. I hope that none of you will take this amiss, but I am struck by the close correlation between at least the more sort of political use of emerging technologies as a way of questioning the value of an SSBN-based deterrent and views that the UK should simply get out of this game. And I think that's relevant because if you were to favour retention of the deterrent but be critical of the SSBN choice on the grounds of emerging new technologies, then it would behove those of you who are in that position, if there are any, to say what is the alternative system that you would opt for. And indeed, there was a question this morning about whether there was some better second strike, assured second strike capability available, and I think the answer to that is no. So I'm not for one moment dismissing concerns about vulnerability. I would never dismiss concerns about cost or technical feasibility. These are all important factors that need to be taken into account. But on the vulnerability point, which was the focus of today's conference, as a number of others have pointed out, the tussle between the hunter and the hunted, and the seesawing of technological advantage between the detector and the person who is who's trying to avoid detection is not a new phenomenon, and I think that while none of us can know exactly how the technologies that have been discussed today will in the end impact on nuclear submarine operations, the likelihood, I believe, is that there will continue to be this battle between the detector and the submarine which is trying to avoid detection. It does not, for me, feel like a horse and tank moment, to use a phrase favoured by former military colleagues in the Ministry of Defence. And that's fundamentally because the size of the oceans and the areas available for the submarines to operate in at this stage, given the points that have been made by the various professors and other experts, it doesn't look likely to be overcome. Now, Nick asked us to reflect on the implications of any change in SSBN vulnerability. And I make the following remarks on the basis of caveated by the comments that I've just made. It does seem to me that much depends on the degree of change. As I've already said, there'll be small shifts taking place at relatively frequent intervals. But clearly, if there came a day when the oceans were transparent, then there would be an impact on strategic stability because of the assumptions about assured second strike capability would be undermined. If the change was significant but fell some way short of transparency in the oceans, for me, CASD would still be a better option for stability, for strategic stability, than the alternatives, for all the reasons that were spelt out in the Trident Alternatives review, which are to do with crisis management and the difficulty of deploying in a crisis, and the difficulties that Paul mentioned of defending a bastion. The question of a potential role for arms control was raised, and I have to say that my initial view was that it would be difficult to see how it would be possible to verify non-use of these new technologies. And given that arms control generally requires some transparency, here we would be in the position of asking arms controllers to verify non-transparency, which seems to me to be somewhat paradoxical. But as I listened to Heather Williams and others talk about the arms control point, and her point, I think that Russia might be more strongly motivated than anybody else to want to limit unconstrained development of some of these technologies. It did occur to me that there might, in theory, be an interesting point where the arms controllers said, well, in order to do the verification, you would have to have sufficient transparency in the oceans. But given that there's not that transparency, we can't do the verification. So I conclude by saying I stick with the position that the government maintains, that strategic stability is best served by the policy that it's engaged on. Thank you.